Welcome back, everyone, to the Op Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, automations, and collaborations from the world of DevOps and the developer experience. I'm your host, Tristan Pollock, with my co-host, CEO of CTO.ai, Kyle Campbell, and we have our best show yet for you today. Our guest today is Steve Pereira.
Pereira.
Pereira, the founder, CEO of Visible, and AKA the value stream whisperer, AKA the Marie Kondo of automation. Some amazing titles here. Welcome, Steve. So great to have you. Sorry about the name.
No problem. It happens. It's not a very common name this side of the Atlantic, I would say.
Where's the ancestry of this name come from?
It's Portuguese, actually, which is not my family origin by generations and generations. It goes way back, but we kept the name going.
Well, my mother-in-law is a big port fan, so that's great to hear. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Visible. I think it's really interesting, and excited to kind of put this on the topic for the day.
Yeah, so it's kind of a niche area that's been growing a lot recently. We look at DevOps and we look at the idea of unifying the activities of development and operations, bringing things closer together, looking more at customer value and looking at outcomes over output. And Visible and value streams are really all about tying everything together from an even broader scope, looking at everything from when something starts costing you money to when it starts making you money. And by zooming out and focusing less on individual activities inside the value stream, we're able to find real opportunities to tackle bottlenecks. And what it means when I say the Marie Kondo of automation is what I advise people to do when they're looking at automation is really put it in the context of the big picture, get rid of everything that you don't need before you start automating. Because, if you're automating a crappy process, you're just creating waste and problems for yourself. So at Visible, we're all about looking at software development and delivery and trying to find those bottlenecks that are really getting in your way, where you're going to see massive returns on investment if you were to clean it up, automate it, and make it a strength instead of a weakness.
And you're looking specifically at value stream management within the software development realm, or can you apply this to any industry, any business function?
That's a great question. And yeah, that's my focus. That's where my expertise and my history lies. I started in tech support. My last gig was actually CTO. And the whole time I've been in software and tech. So that's where all my experience lies. But that being said, it works for things like customer onboarding, for new employee onboarding, for your sales process, for your marketing flow, anything where there's a start and a finish and there's a bunch of stuff going on. There's going to be waste. There's going to be opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, that's great. And you kind of started hinting at it. How did you get into this originally? How did you start being I want to be like this VSM guy that looks at the structure of things and helps people break it down?
That's a really long story, but the short is I've always been sort of a big picture person. I've always had a hard time kind of digging into the details when I sensed that there was a bigger thing going on behind the scenes that, maybe we weren't looking at, or we would benefit from taking a step back and looking at the big picture. But really, if I go back to the beginning of my career, the very beginning, if we're looking at my first interactions with the value stream, it was me making pizzas as a teenager, and working at a pizza shop. I went through a bunch of different roles. It's a very flow-focused business. There's a lot of parallels to building anything. And I went through a couple different positions. I ended up in a place where I was like the guy cutting the pizzas before they went in the pizza box. And I loved that job. And I would perfect my technique of chopping pizzas and sliding them into boxes. And it would take me a second and a half to cut a large pizza. And I don't know if that's a good metric or not. It's completely insignificant, because if we look at the value stream of making a pizza, the time spent in the oven makes all the time slicing the pizza totally irrelevant. Who cares if it's a second and a half? Who cares if it's less than a second, 20 seconds, 2 minutes? It's barely a factor, right? So looking back now at the way that I've done different jobs in the context of the big picture, a bunch of optimization and a bunch of effort to really dial up the efficiency of one specific piece can totally waste your time, right? And as I went through my career in different roles, I would have these experiences where I'd be working with leadership and they wouldn't realize all the value that I was delivering, right? I automated this thing and I built this thing and nobody cares. And it's because people are looking at different things. People care about different things. People care about the big picture. You automating something that isn't delivering value in the context of the big picture is a waste of time. And it's just a recipe for people to get frustrated. And I find that that's a really common thing in software and tech, is that every individual thinks that they're contributing value, but it's only value in the context of the customer, right? You can't come up with your own definition of value. It's what your customers are paying you for, right? It's the outcomes that you're delivering. So that just
so you had to redesign the pizza. You had to basically redesign the big picture so that there was better visibility onto what those bottlenecks were.
Yeah, you've got to really step back and say, out of this entire flow, where are the real bottlenecks? Because if we're not tackling the real bottlenecks, then we're probably wasting our time and we're wasting our effort. And we think that we're contributing value, but if we're not measuring that, you don't know. And so before you take a step in the wrong direction and automate something that's not worth automating, we really have to think of, how does this all fit together? What happens if we automate this, right? Are we automating something that's going to, rocket us in the wrong direction, or is it just going to spin its wheels in place? So I just found that once I started thinking in that direction, I can't unsee it now, and I see value everywhere, and I see flow everywhere, and I see friction everywhere. And a lot of DevOps, I think, is, we commonly hear automate everything, right? And that's just terrible advice if we're ignoring the context of where the automation is best applied. Yeah. So I just think that that's super, super valuable insight, and it saves a lot of time and frustration when it comes to individual contributions to the bottom line.
Can you give us a bit of a history? Because, after I met you and I started understanding this, this is something that happens in my career where, I very much feel like I was always observing the world in a similar way as you. But when I met you and you explained to me what value stream mapping was, I was like, oh, there's a terminology around it. There's a practice. There's a thing here that's real, and it's not just something that I'm noticing up in my head. That was super enlightening. I took it upon myself to do some of my own research, but I think some of the stuff you told me about where value stream mapping came from, almost like the origins of it, similar to Kanban, Agile. I mean, I think that'd be really helpful for people to understand kind of how this has evolved. If you look at the history of what value stream mapping actually is.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something where I find in tech, we often try and reinvent the wheel because we don't consider history. We're not aware of the history. Yeah. Software development is very different than manufacturing, but in many ways it's similar, right? And the history of value stream mapping is traditional manufacturing. It comes from building cars. In the 80s, they were looking at maximizing efficiency and effectiveness and trying to really dial in the process so that they could maximize profit, maximize value. And it comes out of Toyota and practices there to boost efficiency. And a lot of people will look at that effort and say, software is not like manufacturing. We're solving a different problem every single time. We're not building the same product and shoving it off an assembly line. And I completely agree with that. But I think that there's a lot of value in looking at the things that we do repeat over and over and over again, and looking at how we can boost the efficiency there so that we can spend as much time on the variable nebulous creative aspects of the work. So I think that, there's a lot of value in looking at the history. That being said, value stream mapping in the historical context, I think is really inapplicable to software or anywhere, because there's this jargon and symbols. And if you search for value stream mapping and you click on the Wikipedia entry, the first example that you get is completely like foreign, right? It doesn't make sense to me even. And I know the symbols and I know all the terminology and I know it's just this confusing mess. So I think where it's gone and where I'm taking it is, what are the 20% of value stream mapping in a traditional context that deliver 80% of the value? And how do we bring that into the modern world, into the DevOps context, into the software development context? And so I take value stream mapping, which is a bunch of different things, and say, the most important pieces here are the steps and the timing. And we can ignore everything else and add it back if it's valuable. But those are the pieces I focus on. So what are the steps going on in the process? What's the measurement in terms of timing of each of those steps? And that's when we start to see things pop up and become really visible and valuable.
Yeah, well, I think when I did that research, I found that diagram and it felt more like an electrical schematic than it did like something that I could practically understand and use in the context of sharing it with my team, right? I love what you said about taking the stuff that matters, that really works, and applying it, in that sort of 20% rule. I always think about that as the reduction of these big ideas down into an applied and practical approach. And when I think about this, it's almost like a skill that you want to see in the senior developer or even the architect capacity, right? Where it's almost like you're getting people to zoom out and think about the system that you're building, production, DevOps, all of these things. But now think about it from the perspective of end-to-end delivery of how you're delivering software and what are the ways that you can instrument that process to have the highest yield. Do you see that now formalizing more into practitioner roles within the enterprise? Because I know you work with a lot of different companies, and so there's sort of a specialist piece here that you bring to the table. But how are you seeing that actually emerge into the job description for people? And like, what are the sort of practical sort of titles, nuances in the market where you're seeing this go from being something that's more of the specialized role where you're able to work with many companies as a consultant, perhaps into a realm where it's maybe an actual specific role in a company? I know there's like DevOps dojos and DevOps practitioners now, which are sort of these big practice leaders. I mean, share a little bit about that with us so people can understand how it's finding its way into the job market.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area, and it's rapidly evolving. And we're seeing sort of different incarnations in different places and different ways that's becoming a core capability inside of companies. In a general sense, I would love to see this as a natural tool in every employee's tool belt. The idea that, when we have, as engineers, when we have an engineering problem, one of our most like natural instincts is to jump on a whiteboard and, draw a map that connects a bunch of boxes together, a static map, right? Of just to organize our thinking and share ideas. But we don't often think in terms of flow. We don't often illustrate in terms of flow. And in terms where, one of those boxes is the customer getting value. And I think that that's something that all of us just need to sort of start adopting, because the world is becoming more and more customer centric. We're connecting these dots where IT is no longer a thing that has no customer. It's very much part of how we deliver value. And the way that we're seeing this sort of develop inside of the enterprise is, we have things like the value stream architect position inside of Walmart, inside of a lot of the Dojo consortium companies that are adopting Dojo practices. I am developing a system, like I have a program where I go into larger companies and create something called a value delivery enabling team, which is part of the model that's presented by Team Topologies. I don't know if you guys have seen the book Team Topologies, but it's a DevOps book that is focused on four key team types. And you've got things like a platform team, product delivery teams. You've got sort of a technical excellence team that is really focused on specific technologies. And then you will have these enabling teams that sort of help unblock other teams who are trying to deliver value. And I see an opportunity for this idea of an enabling team that's focused on value delivery. And what that means is they sort of come in as an outside perspective to look at the value stream inside another team, so a product delivery team, for example, and basically do the work that I'm doing, but on a more regular basis inside the company. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to adopt these techniques and capabilities just as a way that you're doing business on a constant and consistent basis, because it's something that never really should stop. This idea of unblocking and improving flow and improving our productivity and value delivered. Like, why does that have to be something that we tackle when we have tons of friction and everyone's tearing their hair out versus just something that we run every 3 weeks as a part of a retrospective, or every 3 months as part of a retrospective. And I think is really valuable when we think of companies like Microsoft, for instance. They've got, like, this is a few years ago, but they had 1,500 people who were dedicated towards internal productivity, right? Unblocking process and making sure that, like, value could flow through the organization. There's very few companies in the world that have that kind of dedicated energy and effort. But I think, the proof is in the pudding. Companies like Microsoft and companies that are focused on enabling developers and making sure that they're able to do their best work without fighting friction all the time, you get happier employees, but you also get much better results.
Can you unpack, just for anyone who maybe doesn't already understand this, can you unpack the idea of a dojo? And as I understand it, this is often something, and some of these tactics are often things that emerge in larger organizations. And so I always think, there's value in a value stream at any stage, but there's obviously a tipping point, and tactics might change, and the way you approach this problem might change based on the different size. Can you maybe just unpack what a dojo is, especially as it relates to kind of the enterprise concepts, and then comment a bit about, team size and how you think about value streams fitting into smaller teams, where most of the thought leadership around this is obviously in larger teams, because that's where there's a larger yield to be found effectively.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And this kind of all really bubbled up for me recently when I had to publish an experience report for a conference, an Agile conference, actually. And I was kind of comparing and contrasting 3 different organization sizes, like the startup and the small, medium enterprise, and then the enterprise, the extremely large enterprise, like a Fortune 10 company. And there's, the practice of value stream mapping works extremely well in all of those company sizes, but there's a different focus to each one. But to get to your earlier point about dojos, I think, dojos exist the definition is sort of like an area of practice, or like a location for people to go and adopt new skills and practice those skills. And I think, it's extremely valuable in 2020 when, we have gigantic enterprises that have this very different distribution of skills across the organization, right? You've got some people coming in with the latest skills. You've got people who've been there for 35 years and they're extremely skilled at what they're doing. But when it comes to adopting new practices or pivoting in a new direction, adopting new capabilities, it's a really hard thing to execute on. And it doesn't come from just putting people through training and getting them certified in whatever. It has to become sort of part of the way that they work. And an effective way of doing that is to sort of take them out of their everyday environment, give them a set of problems and practices and almost like a curriculum to follow that gets them used to working in a new way, or exposes them to new techniques, trains them in more of a collaborative setting and like a co-working setting than just straight training, right? Because I think in a lot of cases, training could just go over people's heads if they're not receptive to it. And a lot of people respond to doing, right, rather than just absorbing information. So the dojo is sort of this idea of, we can bring a team into the dojo, we can work with them, pairing with them in many cases, showing them, here's how I would solve this problem, doing things like code reviews together. And it kind of grows that capability in the team that they can then leave and continue the practice and come back whenever there's something new to learn, or when they feel like they can be sharpening the saw. So I think there's a lot of value there. It's, it can be done well and it can be done poorly. It can just be another silo, right? And depending on how you incentivize it, it could be, you're either putting all the responsibility on the dojo team to get results, or, you have this more positive, collaborative environment. So I think there's a lot of execution there that hasn't been ironed out yet, but there's a lot of great research and efforts that have been shared by people like companies in the Dojo consortium. So there's some really great evidence to how to do this, what works, what doesn't work, and it's starting to pick up a lot of steam. To speak more about the startup versus the enterprise, I think what I see very often in startups is, because of the agility and speed in a startup, the tendency to execute, and the aversion to sort of long-term planning, what's really valuable to focus on in the context of a value stream map for a startup is like clarity, right? And visibility into like what's going on, right? What are we doing? Because you just sort of, you're running at top speed, right? And you could be running, it's very easy to be running in the wrong direction or veer off into the wrong direction, because, you can't always call in all hands and get everybody on the same page. Sometimes you don't know what that page is, right? Sometimes you don't know what the perfect goal should be, or what the next best step is. So I think, taking that step back and running a value stream mapping exercise, it accomplishes a bunch of things. It can build a sense of empathy and like team building by showing people, here's what's happening upstream from you and downstream from you, right? Like, these people depend on your work and you depend on this person for work. So, you have to develop relationships with these people, right? You have to be aware of what's affected by work that you deliver and how it fits into the big picture. In the enterprise, what you see is like complexity and inertia, right? So you've got really complex interactions between silos. So you'll have teams that are focused on providing X, teams that are focused on Y. They don't talk in many cases. They're not aware of each other's bottlenecks or challenges or goals. And so it can be valuable to look at the value stream and say, you guys are handing work to each other. Here's what it looks like. There's a 4-week wait from the time that silo X finishes their work to when silo Y starts working on their piece. And it wouldn't take much to close that gap. But until you step back and do that work, do that exercise, you're not going to get that outcome. There's alignment challenges, everywhere, but in an enterprise, it's very easy for a silo to be very clearly aligned in one direction and another silo to be off in a completely different direction, pulling against each other, right? Always thinking that everything would be great if it weren't for those guys. Mm-hmm. And so,
or even working on the same project in tandem, not knowing it, or
oh yeah, that's another huge thing. The more we start to build these common understandings of what's going on, these things pop up. And it can be, that brings me to a good point, is this can be a painful activity if it's not framed properly. We don't always want to be pulling up the rug and seeing what's been swept under there for 5, 10, 50 years, right? So part of my job, and something that I've constantly try to take more seriously, is this idea that this is sensitive stuff, right? People don't like to be told that what's not working or shown what could be better, but that's how we improve, right? So we have to kind of frame this in the context of positivity. You don't get to the nice, clean Marie Kondo-ized house without pulling everything out of the closets and piling it on the floor first, right? So
I think that's the most valuable thing that I've seen about it in a smaller team. I mean, you ran this process with us so that we could experience it. And one of the things that I thought was really cool about it was, and I think this is more specific to a startup, in a startup, that you're making certain compromises, but then you have this opportunity to reconcile which are like intentional compromises and which are unintentional compromises. And I think like that is one of the biggest things that creates cognitive overhead and mental fog for people when they think about the challenge, because everyone who wants to do the job right, and everyone wants to do it well, but in a startup you often have to compromise on those things, and there's certain things where it's like that doesn't work, or that waits 4 weeks and it just fell through the cracks, and that's okay. But acknowledging that versus an intentional, well, we know this takes 4 weeks and we think we can get it to 1 week later, but we're willing to make this compromise for now because our focus is over here. I think that really empowers people in that positive light to help them understand that it is within their control, and you can sort of have a way of sort of mentally reconciling what are all these different fires that are burning, in your head. And I think it's when things have been, avoided or swept under the rug for too long that it suddenly becomes this insurmountable thing to get over. And I think about this a lot in the form of just like we talk about technical debt. Well, I think there's all kinds of debt: process debt, automation debt, communication debt, clarity debt, like whatever. I think the more you can have a process to clear that area, as you're saying, the better it helps people just function at their best, because they're not sort of like looking over their shoulder about that thing that they know they cut a corner on and when's that going to come back to bite, because you're being really intentional and being supported in the sense of like, well, we know it takes that long and we're okay with that, and there's a clear communication amongst the team to say we accept that compromise, which then allows people to prioritize the thing that's kind of the higher yield instead of worrying about cleaning up behind them, to your analogy there, right?
Yeah, I think that's a huge deal. And it just sort of brings to mind this image of like there's more than one elephant in the room all the time, right? There's always something that everyone is trying to ignore so that they can focus on the thing that they want to be doing. And it's fine to have those elephants there, but if we're ignoring them, right? If we're not intentionally saying, yes, that's a thing, we're not going to solve that right now because the priority is here, that helps a lot of people feel okay and feel confident that people know what's going on, that they're being heard, that the environment is one in which it's safe to surface challenges and talk about challenges. And we have these events like a value stream mapping exercise where it's safe to do that, and you don't want to be doing that every single day, right? You don't want to be poking holes every day. But if we establish a space like a value stream mapping exercise where it's like, okay, for the purposes of accomplishing this goal, let's get everything out on the table, then you're establishing this environment of trust, accountability, transparency, communication, and collaboration that I think pays off over the long term. And it clears the way for the time in between to say like, yeah, we have an opportunity to raise concerns, and it's not every single day, all day. It's, when we intentionally do that exercise for the purposes of improving, right? And I think that's why I'm a big fan of retrospectives. That's why I'm a fan of like every opportunity that we take to step back and look at the big picture, because that change in perspective allows us to change our mode of thinking and get rid of a lot of that cognitive overhead or dread that can just pile up when we're like, I see that thing, but we're not addressing it. And it worries me, right? Because it concerns me. It might not be concerning everyone, but if we have those opportunities where we can all get on the same page and say, yeah, that is a thing, we just can't do it right now. And that's okay. Are you okay with that? And oftentimes, acknowledging things means that we can move forward, right? Where it stops dragging us down because it's something that it's there and we're trying to shut it out of our minds.
Yeah, it's like the next level beyond a retro, right? Like a retro is good for that, but what's really good with this is you bring in all of those different stakeholders, different considerations beyond just, one discipline, and you sort of can rationalize the different competing interests, as you said it earlier. I mean, maybe not competing, but maybe they're not the same focus points. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then when is the right time to perform like a value stream exercise? Do you often do these at team retreats, or like, how do you think about creating that, that safe space, and also like when's the right time to jump in and like do one of these so that you're, if you haven't already been doing a repeatable process around it?
Yeah, that always reminds me of the tree analogy, where the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. I really think that the same is true with value stream mapping. It's, if you don't know what your value stream looks like, you're probably tackling the wrong bottleneck, right? You're probably headed in the wrong direction. And you might get lucky, and, your instincts might be pointing you in the right direction. You really might be automating the right things. You might be making the right improvements, but, I really think it pays off to have an intentional practice around that, especially if you profess to be a data-driven organization, or a highly transparent organization, or an organization that does things systematically. And if you're just making gut decisions about what to focus on and what to spend your time on and invest in, then I don't know how true that is. And people get a sense, that you're talking a talk that you're not walking, right? So I think that it's important, if you're walking down the road of increased accountability and visibility and transparency, that you adopt a practice like this, because it gives you the confidence to say, we know what's going on, and we can validate assumptions, and we can test hypotheses, and we can start moving towards being more data driven and improve the confidence of not just ourselves. Oftentimes, as leaders, we can be very confident in our direction, but that's not always shared by everyone else on our team, right? And we can assume that everyone's on board, everyone is behind us, and we're all aligned, and everyone is really excited about what we're doing. But how often are you testing that and making sure that that's true? And how certain are you when you think of the data behind your assumptions and your decisions and your direction? So I would say, there's never a bad time to do it. There's definitely better ways to do it. I would say that, a traditional method of value stream mapping commonly takes a few days up to a week. And I think that's way overblown, because I think they're collecting a bunch of data they don't necessarily need. And these days, I'm not cooping people up in a conference room. I do it all remotely online. And, even between when we did it, Kyle, for CTO, and now, it's way better and easier to do it online and remotely. Yeah. You don't get the same level of fidelity, but you're getting a bunch of extra bonuses. Like, everybody can be collaborating on it the whole time. And it's actually more of a team building exercise. So I want to rerun one with you guys.
Cool.
I'll do one free of charge.
Hey,
if you guys want to test out.
You heard it first.
Amazing.
If you guys want to do the new remote pattern, we could even film it and share it with everybody. Cool. If you guys want.
That would be cool.
And because I love this, I think, it's been a big adjustment for me, not being able to be in person with everybody, but the remote tools that we have now, and the ability for just everybody to be involved and contributing and heard, I just think it's so much better, because you don't have that, you don't have the super loud person in the conference room sucking up all the air. Now everybody can be anonymous. That's me if I'm in the room.
Yeah.
But I think, that you can run these things now, and everybody can be anonymous. Everyone can really speak their mind, and we can be very clear that this is not like a complaining session, but this is an opportunity to really share your thoughts, and let's talk about them. And we might park them for another exercise, but it really makes it accessible to people. And I think that's super valuable.
Well, the macro effect is certainly, I think, driving people to rethink how we work together, right? And I think that's one of the hypotheses we really share, and I'm really excited about what you're doing, obviously, what we're thinking about. And I sort of have like a couple questions. We talk about automation and automating the wrong things, the right things. So in your thought, in your experience, having looked at many of these value streams, which I'm sure are unique, but you can draw some similarities between them, what are the things that you've seen people automate which are the lowest value things, and what are some of the things that you've seen people automate which are maybe the highest value things? And then just generally, I'd love to you mentioned tools, especially in this remote world, present company aside, like what are some of the tools that are emerging in this space? What are some of the technologies that people are looking at as far as how they can incorporate this idea of value stream mapping, which is big picture? Like how do they how are they thinking about applying it beyond just the initial process of mapping it out and then taking it into practice?
Yeah, those are great topics of conversation. I think, the things that I see often people waste a lot of time and energy on at any level. So the biggest enterprises and the smallest companies right now, their engineers, their product folks, their project folks, they'll get attached to some metric or ideal that they see off in the ecosystem, right? In other companies, things like deployment automation, right? Deployment automation for me is a classic mistake that most people make, not in terms of having it, but in improving it. Like if you're going from an hour down to a 10-minute objective, like a lot of people have 10 minutes in their head. 10 minutes is great. Once we get to 10 minutes, we can move on to something else. But really, if you're deploying like once a week and it takes an hour, who cares? Because over the course of that week, you probably had 5 meetings that you didn't even need to have. And they probably all more than an hour. And they probably left everybody completely drained and not even able to go back to their work with a clear head, excited about doing their work. And you could have opportunities where some piece of your process transfers from one person to the next person, and it happens via email, or it happens via some mechanism that is far from automated. And that adds a day or two, right? And if that person is not available, they don't have a backup, then if they're on vacation or they're out sick, now we're looking at a week. Now we're looking at maybe 2 weeks. And so if we compare 2 weeks to 50 minutes for deployment automation, like it starts to look really silly to be focused on things like deployment automation, right? And we can't see that disparity. We can't see that relative measurement unless we map the value stream and we look and say, actually, I'm good with the way deployment automation is, because to fix this 2-week problem is just a matter of saying, Sam, you're prime on this, and Kathy's going to be your backup. And so it never falls through the cracks. If Sam's not available, Kathy picks it up. Great. We never have a 2-week gap of work just falling through the cracks. And that's a huge improvement, right? And it might not come up every single week, but it could come up often enough that it's a major problem that makes deployment automation look like totally insignificant.
So communication is one of the highest overhead things in any organization ultimately.
Totally. Yeah. Flow of communication is massive, and handoffs of work from one individual or one department, one silo to another.
Is that just context related? Like context going, passing work from A to B, there's some level of missing context in that transfer of information? Is that one of the driving forces?
Yeah. So often what happens is you've got product to development where the requirements for something aren't put in the context that's really valuable to an engineer, right? And they're missing some key detail. And you can actually get by in many cases where the engineer is like, okay, I think I knew what they were going for, and they can sort of bridge the gap. But often what happens is they can't bridge the gap, and they either end up building the wrong thing, which means that you're wasting all the time going all the way back, or it has to be tossed product then and said like, I don't have, I don't have enough information to build this, right? Or, there's not enough detail. The acceptance criteria isn't clear. And so those are key opportunities to make sure, like, what would it take to always have an actionable task, right? What's the sort of API between these two roles, so that they can pass information to each other and it's always understood, it's always actionable. I think we spend very little time thinking about interact. And I don't want to transform people into APIs, but there's a lot of, let's say, analogies that we could take advantage of when we think of, okay, if we have one service talking to another service, they have to speak the same language, they have to be passing data that can be easily understood between the two of them, and it can't just fall on the floor, right? And it can't just wait around for some clarity that needs to be defined. So I would like to see a lot of that. I would like to see communication and collaboration become more of a focus. And that's kind of the goal behind something like a value delivery enabling team, is to look at flow and look at where things are breaking down, where those delays are, where are those opportunities to boost collaboration. And to speak about the tooling side of it, and what makes it easier to execute, I think, using as few disparate tools as possible is really valuable. If you've got half your operations, if all your designers are working in Asana and all your developers are working in Jira, you're going to have a bad time, right? Regardless of what plumbing you put in between those things, it's going to be a really challenging scenario. And we have to kind of intentionally build those flows, not just within a function, but within the entire value stream, and say, from start to finish, we're going through 50 different tools. And so there better be a good reason for that, right? We better be getting value out of those tools. We better be considering the friction of transferring from one to the other. And so, looking at fewer tools or integrations between tools, if things are going between one person and another person by email, that's a real opportunity to make that somewhat more automated. In terms of value stream management and the idea of like continuously collecting data and optimizing on a more continued basis, keeping track of flow, that is very early days. I think we're really just starting down the road in that respect, because we've got a lot of complexity now. And it's kind of like a response almost to that complexity, where we're starting to realize, like, the average enterprise has 2,500 tools inside of like a given division of the company. That seems low to me, even. Like, I hear about companies that have like 500 separate instances of Slack, and they're paying a separate bill for every single one of them, and they're not connected together, right? That kind of yeah, that kind of chaos is all over the place. And so, in many ways, the value stream management, the management aspect of it, is the appeal for a lot of people, is the idea of like, how do we wrangle all this complexity and get a single view of what's going on as much as that's possible. I don't see, like, a silver bullet for that anytime soon, but there's a lot of vendors kind of tackling the space, and I've seen some good development. I wouldn't say that there's there's no slack of value stream management at the moment, but I think they are chasing something that's really valuable, in that we're putting integration in context of flow and outcomes, right? We can plug all kinds of things in together, but if it's not for the purpose of delivering better customer outcomes, then who cares, right? I mean, you can build a Rube Goldberg machine that makes your coffee, but if it's not the way you like it, who cares? So I think, we're going to see a lot of development over the next couple months and years in this space. I mean, it's going to go for ages. DevOps has been around for over a decade now, Agile more than two. The value stream thinking aspect of the next generation that we're headed towards, we're going to be on another 10-year journey, and it's just started now.
Yeah. I so buy into that. I mean, all of the converging points you said are things that we think about on a daily basis. Slack, how do we bring communication tools and communication closer together to stop that big gap, or that big step, and wait period between handoffs. How do we make it easy for people to automate across all of their tools using sort of a control plane piece, right? We're not going to get rid of all those tools, on day one. So how do we give you at least, a steering wheel, a gas pedal, and a brake is what I always say. You don't need to know if it's engine or electric today. We'll figure that out as we, as the technology advances. And so I'm really excited about the emergence of this space, everything that you've been doing, because I think you're right. I think over the next 10 years, we start to figure out what this distributed enterprise, tactical approach looks like. And we've been working on a little bit of a concept that I'll have to share with you after the show and get your feedback on, called the Ops Mesh, where we're thinking a lot about how to enable that, distributed decision making that has to happen bottom up. How do you enable people to adopt whatever tools they want? But then how do you centralize access to that through the control plane, something like Slack, but also feed data into the right hands of the right people who need that context? Because I don't think, nobody ever makes bad decisions. They just, no one ever fails. It's the only time you've ever seen someone fail is when there's some sort of missing context that they didn't have. Why am I trying to achieve this? Or that feedback loop, I think, in most companies that I've seen is very broken. We've only ever had two approaches where, we push these tools top down, or they get adopted bottom up. And, in either case, we're not closing the feedback loop on the value stream between the technology and the business often. And I think the more that, from a DevOps perspective and developers in general can be thinking about how to drive transparency into the work that they're doing and the value that they're delivering, where we started the show, right? I think the better it creates the ability for the stakeholders to be able to invest into their success, invest into automation, invest into the right kinds of automation, most importantly. And I think that feedback loop has been broken for a long time, and we're now starting to really understand it with the work that you're doing with value streams and others as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, we find ourselves in a scenario where we have tool proliferation all over the place, and there's always a different way to solve a problem without that kind of decision support and systems for how do we do things. We're going to be constantly picking new tools. We're going to be constantly integrating things. What are the 3 rules that we should always follow? What are the 3 metrics that we should always be trying to impact? We could always be adopting new stuff. And I think that the distributed teams and increased autonomy just make this even more painful, where you sort of put your teams in a scenario where you have these problems, you're empowered to fix them, but no guidelines around how we should incorporate these solutions into the big picture, right? What is the criteria for adopting a new tool? And what the effect is that you have a bunch of really smart, ambitious people try to solve a problem, and then they get invested in their solution, and all of a sudden they're fighting to use a tool that's actually moving people in the wrong direction because it's outside of the context of the larger picture, right? The bigger goal, or the metrics that really matter. And I think that we're just in a position where that is really happening now all the time, and it's affecting startups, medium-sized companies, and gigantic enterprises alike. And it's something that we can really solve with a few simple practices and principles that are starting to arise as part of how we do things. Just the same way as we're all bought into the principles behind DevOps now. These are the next step in really kind of driving us to better performance and better outcomes.
Well, that's really, thanks for sharing this, Steve. It's been an awesome episode. I think we're really excited to dive back in with you at some point. And I'm going to spend a bunch of time just looking at all these different graphs of value stream management under Google Images for the next week now. But we're just about out of time. Where can people go find you?
Yeah, well, I got to say thanks for having me. It's always amazing to talk to you folks, and I really am excited to see where you're headed, and everything that you've achieved so far has been so amazing. So excited to talk more about that. For me, anything that you want to follow around Visible or my work is at visible.is. And I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, not so much time on Twitter. But I've got how to get started with value stream mapping on my site. I've got everything from what is a value stream, how do you do mapping, how I do mapping, a bunch of free resources, templates, a bunch of stuff that I just give away. So definitely check that out. And yeah, if there's an opportunity, I can share a few links for recent talks where I just go over everything from start to finish. But yeah, excited to dig back into it with you guys too, because I think we could generate some really great content in the context of CTO and what do the value streams look like when they're applied to a real startup environment that's moving the needle and just taking off as a rocket ship.
Hey, appreciate that. Appreciate that.
Well, that was. I'll drop all those links into the description, and thank you so much for coming on. That's it for us. Take us out, Kyle.
Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Such a good one.
Yeah, that was. Oh yeah. I wish we would have pulled up more schematics now of this, but I'll drop